second week of November, and Marta had been driving for almost 4 hours when the engine warning light came on. She was on the E45 in southern Sweden, roughly 60 kilometers north of Gothenburg, and the road was almost completely empty. It was midnight. She pulled onto the hard shoulder, put her hazards on, and sat for a moment trying to decide what to do. Her phone had signal. Not great signal, 2 bars, but enough to call roadside assistance. She made the call and was told someone would reach her in approximately 40 to 50 minutes. She locked her doors and waited. 12 minutes passed. A lorry went by, then 2 cars in quick succession, then nothing for a long stretch. She had the heater running low to save fuel, and she was watching the road in both mirrors. At the 20-minute mark, a silver estate car slowed as it passed her and pulled onto the hard shoulder roughly 80 meters ahead. She assumed it was someone stopping to help, which happens. She watched the car sit there with its hazards on. Nobody got out. She waited. 5 minutes went by, and the car didn't move. Nobody got out. She couldn't see clearly into the rear window because of the angle and the dark. She called the roadside assistance line again and updated them. The operator told her to stay in her vehicle with the doors locked, which she was already doing. Then the hazards on the silver car went off, and the car didn't move. It just sat there in the dark. No lights at all now, 80 meters ahead of her on the hard shoulder. She couldn't tell if the engine was running. She couldn't tell if anyone was watching her in their rearview mirror. She had no way of knowing, and that absence of information is exactly what began to pull at something deep in her chest. She called the police. She explained the situation and admitted she wasn't sure if anything was actually wrong. The dispatcher took her location and told her a patrol would check in when one was nearby, but they were stretched that night. She should stay put and stay locked in. She sat there and watched that dark car for another 18 minutes. When the roadside assistance van finally appeared behind her and the operative got out and walked to her window, she pointed ahead at the silver car. The operative looked at it, said he'd check it out, and walked toward it. She watched him in her side mirror. He walked the full 80 meters, looked in through the window, looked around, and came back. He told her the car was empty. No one inside. Doors locked. She asked if there was anyone on the embankment or in the trees at the edge of the road. He shone his torch around and said he couldn't see anyone. They got her car running again within 20 minutes. She followed the van to the next service area to collect herself before continuing. She never received any explanation for the silver car. The police follow-up call 3 days later confirmed that the car had been reported abandoned. It had been stolen 9 days earlier from a neighborhood in Malm. She still doesn't fully understand what those 38 minutes on the hard shoulder actually were, and the thing she says she cannot stop thinking about is this. The operative walked 80 meters of open road alone in the dark and came back with nothing. No person, no explanation, no reason, just a stolen car with locked doors and cold engine, and the dark tree line beyond it that his torch did not fully reach. If someone had been crouched in the dark between those 2 cars, they would have had every opportunity. She would not have seen them coming. This account was documented by a long-haul driver named Christopher, who has driven freight routes across Central Europe for 11 years. He submitted this to a road safety forum in 2021, and it was later picked up by several true crime researchers for its procedural detail. He was eastbound on a Polish national road, a single carriageway through agricultural flatland, on a night in late January. It was just after 2 in the morning. He knew the route well. He had driven it dozens of times. He first noticed the black panel van behind him around the 50-kilometer mark. He noticed it because of how it was driving, not aggressively, not erratically, precisely. It was maintaining an exact distance behind his lorry, which Christopher estimated at around 40 meters, and it was doing this consistently, not in the way a tired driver unconsciously follows the vehicle ahead, but with what felt like deliberate calibration. When he slowed marginally, the van slowed by the same margin. When a long, gentle bend in the road briefly allowed him to see further back, he counted the van's lights in his mirror, and they were always the same distance away. He drove for another 20 kilometers watching this. He knew there was a fuel station coming up on the right, and he made the decision to pull in. He did not indicate until the last possible moment, and he turned in quickly. The van passed without slowing. He sat in the fuel station for 15 minutes, spoke to the attendant briefly, bought coffee, and when he pulled back onto the road, there was nothing behind him for as far as the forecourt lights reached into the dark. He drove for another 30 kilometers without incident. Then, the black van was behind him again. He had no explanation for this. The road had no junctions he could recall between his fuel stop and where the van reappeared. Either it had been waiting ahead of him somewhere without lights, or it had turned around, or there was a second vehicle. He did not know which possibility disturbed him most. What he did know was that he had been stationary for 15 minutes, and the van had had 15 minutes to do whatever it needed to do. To get ahead. To wait. To be ready. And now it was behind him again at exactly the same distance as before. He tried something. He slowed significantly, below the speed that would make commercial sense for any legitimate driver on a transit route at that hour. He brought the lorry down to 50 kilometers per hour on a road where 65 to 70 was standard. The van slowed with him. He called his dispatcher and explained the situation. His dispatcher told him to get to a manned border crossing or a 24-hour facility and not to stop on the open road. There was a truck stop roughly 40 kilometers ahead. He drove it at normal speed, watching the van the entire time. He pulled into the truck stop, drove slowly through the whole facility, parked under the brightest lights he could find near the main building, and left his engine running. He watched in his mirrors. The van pulled into the truck stop behind him. It stopped near the entrance, in a poorly lit section away from the building, and it sat there. Christopher walked inside, spoke to the staff, and asked them to call the police. He went back to his lorry and watched the van from his cab with the doors locked. 40 minutes later, a police vehicle arrived. The two officers walked to the van. One of them shone a torch inside while the other stood back. The van was empty. The registration was later traced to a rental company in Warsaw. The rental record showed it had been rented by a man who had provided forged identification documents. The vehicle had been rented 6 days prior and was 6 days overdue for return. Nobody was ever identified. What the police told Christopher at the scene, matter-of-factly, was that this was a pattern they had encountered before on this route. That lorries, particularly those carrying high-value freight, were sometimes followed by advanced scouts, determining whether a driver could be isolated, boxed in, or pressured to stop at a chosen location. That what he had experienced was most likely that. He asked them what usually happened in the cases where the driver did stop. The officer thought about it for a moment, and then said it varied. Christopher has since changed his route. This is the account that has stayed with me the longest. I want to be careful with how I tell it, because the people it happened to are real, and they requested that certain specific details be altered to protect their privacy. In the summer, a man named David was driving his wife and their 7-year-old daughter home from a week in the countryside in the south of France. It was early evening when they set out, still light. Their daughter fell asleep in the back within the first hour. His wife dozed off not long after. David was fine, not tired, content to drive. Around 11 at night, they were on a quiet departmental road, one of the smaller routes that cuts between the major highways through farming country. David had taken it to avoid motorway tolls. He had driven it before without any issue. He stopped for fuel at a station that was quiet but open. One other car was parked at the side of the building. A man was sitting on the low wall near the air pump. He was not doing anything, not looking at his phone, not smoking, just sitting in the way that people sit when they are waiting for something specific. David filled the tank, went inside to pay, bought water, and came back out. The man near the air pump had moved. He was now standing closer to David's car, maybe 4 meters from the passenger side. He was doing nothing visibly threatening, just standing there, looking at the car. David got in, locked the doors, and pulled out. He thought nothing more of it for about 8 minutes. Then, he noticed headlights behind him. The road was narrow and winding through vineyards, and the headlights behind him were close. Not dangerously close, but close enough to be uncomfortable on that kind of road. David picked up speed slightly. The headlights stayed with him. He reached a small village, slowed, passed through it. The headlights followed through the village. His wife was still asleep. He didn't wake her. He was watching the road and the mirror in alternating focus now, and he noticed something that locked his attention completely. The car behind him had taken every turn he had taken. This was not in itself proof of anything. These were small roads, and it was possible they were simply heading in the same direction. But there had been 3 turns in the last 6 minutes, and the car had matched all 3 without hesitation. No slowing, no consideration. As if it knew in advance. He made a decision. At the next junction he turned left when his route was right. He did it without indicating. The car behind him turned left. He kept his breathing steady. He woke his wife quietly and told her to stay calm and listen. He told her there was a car behind them that had been following them for some time. She said nothing for a moment and then asked if he was sure. He told her about the turns. She reached back and checked their daughter was still asleep. David called the emergency services. He gave his location as best he could and described the situation. The operator told him to head toward a town, toward light and population, not to stop on the rural road and not to confront the other driver under any circumstances. The nearest town was 14 kilometers away. 14 kilometers of dark agricultural road with no lights and nowhere to go except forward. He drove those 14 kilometers with his wife watching the mirror and reading him the gap. The car behind them never fell back and never came closer. It simply followed at a fixed distance that felt almost deliberate in its patience. When he reached the edge of town and the street lights started and other cars appeared, he pulled into the forecourt of an open pharmacy, as brightly lit a space as he could find, and he stopped. He watched the road. The following car slowed as it reached the junction just before the pharmacy, sat there for a moment, and then drove on without turning in. It was a dark green estate car. That is all he could confirm. His wife had memorized the last 3 characters of the plate when it passed under a light in the village. The police ran it. The car had not been reported stolen. The registered owner was a man in his 50s with no criminal record who lived in the region. The police spoke to the owner the following morning. He stated he had been out that evening, but denied following anyone, and there was no evidence that contradicted him and no evidence that confirmed his account either way. The file was closed. David still drives that route sometimes for work. He has never been able to identify what that night actually was. He knows what it felt like. He knows what the pattern of those turns meant to him in the moment. He knows that his daughter was asleep in the back seat, and that he made it to that pharmacy, and that nothing happened. He knows that the file is closed, and that the man the police spoke to denied everything and was never charged with anything. But he also knows that someone in a dark green car made every single turn he made on an empty road at midnight. And he has never found a version of that which fully makes sense. Neither have I.